He spent $1 on the worthless filly everyone laughed at. Then she ran one race that made him a millionaire. Caleb Turner didn't go to that dusty Wyoming auction to buy a horse. He went to forget his own life for an hour. Then he saw a tiny, trembling filly no one wanted. He raised one hand for $1 and walked home with a quiet miracle. Because the day that little horse learned to run, Caleb didn't just win money, he got his life back. The auction yard sat on the edge of the high plains like a place time had forgotten. Dust lifted with every step, hanging in the air beneath a sky stretched wide and pale, the kind of sky that made a man feel small whether he wanted to or not. Old pickup trucks lined the fence, their doors slamming shut, as ranchers gathered, coffee cups in hand, eyes sharp for bargains. This was where animals were reduced to numbers, to weight and muscle and resale value. Nothing personal ever survived long in a place like this. Caleb Turner stood near the back, his hands tucked into the pockets of a faded work jacket. He hadn't come to buy anything. He never did. Money on a farm like his was spoken for before it ever arrived. Feed, repairs, insurance premiums, he barely managed to keep current, the quiet, constant math of survival. He was only there because Martha at the feed store had mentioned the auction in passing, said it might do him good to get out of the fields for an afternoon. Caleb hadn't argued. Arguing required energy. He simply went. The auctioneer's voice rose and fell in a practiced rhythm as calves and yearlings passed through the ring. Some sold fast, some didn't sell at all. Caleb watched without really seeing, his mind drifting the way it often did when noise surrounded him. He was thinking about the fence line that still needed mending before winter, about the cost of diesel, about how the wind had sounded different lately, sharper, almost impatient. Then the laughter started. It wasn't cruel at first. More surprised than anything. Caleb looked up as the next animal was led into the ring. At first glance, it hardly looked like a horse. Too small, too thin. Its legs trembled as if they weren't entirely convinced they belonged to the body they were carrying. Mud clung to its coat in uneven patches, and its mane lay flat and dull against its neck. A filly, tiny, unfinished. "Well now," the auctioneer said, trying to sound amused, "looks like we've got ourselves a little mystery today." Someone near the front chuckled. Another voice called out, "That thing won't last a month out here." The laughter grew louder. The filly flinched at the sound, her head jerking slightly as if she were bracing for a blow that never came. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and dark, reflecting the ring lights with a glassy fear that didn't belong in a place meant for buying and selling. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. The bidding started low. $5. No response. $3. Still nothing. The auctioneer glanced around, forcing a grin, trying to keep the mood light. "Come on now, folks. Surely she's worth something?" Silence answered him. The filly shifted her weight, hooves scraping softly against the dirt. She wasn't pulling against the lead rope. She wasn't trying to run. She was simply standing there, small and exposed, as if she had already learned that resistance only made things worse. $1, the auctioneer finally said, his voice flattening. "Can I get $1? A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd again, sharper this time. Caleb barely heard it. He was looking at the filly's eyes. There was no drama in them, no plea, just a quiet, exhausted awareness, the kind that came from having nowhere left to go. Without thinking, without calculating feed costs or vet bills, or whether his farm's liability insurance would even cover another animal, Caleb raised his hand. The motion felt slow, heavy, like lifting it through water. A few heads turned. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. $1, he repeated, more to confirm than to encourage. "I've got one." No one countered. Not a single voice rose. The gavel came down with a dull crack that echoed louder than it should have. "Sold," the auctioneer said, pointing. "To the gentleman in the back." The laughter faded into murmurs. Someone muttered something Caleb didn't catch. He didn't care. His heart was beating harder than it had all day, and he wasn't entirely sure why. He stepped forward as the handler brought the filly toward him, her small body shaking now that the noise had shifted in her direction. Up close, she looked even smaller, fragile in a way that made the air around her feel thinner. Caleb didn't reach for her right away. He'd learned long ago that sudden movements only made frightened things worse. Instead, he stood there, letting her see him, letting the moment settle. "It's all right," he said quietly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, unused, rough around the edges. "You're coming with me." The filly didn't relax, but she didn't pull away either. As Caleb signed the paper and handed over a single wrinkled dollar bill, a thought crossed his mind, uninvited and unsettling. He had no plan, no intention beyond this moment. He had simply seen something small and afraid, and decided, for reasons he couldn't explain, not to walk away. He took the lead rope in his hand, feeling the faint tremor run through it, and said under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else, "Let's get you home." The trailer rattled softly behind Caleb's truck as he pulled away from the auction yard, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the road. He checked the rearview mirror more often than necessary. Each time, he caught a glimpse of the filly's small shape, standing stiffly inside the trailer, her head low, her balance uncertain with every turn. She didn't whinny. She didn't stomp. She simply endured the motion, as if movement itself was something to be survived. Caleb drove slower than usual. Not because he was cautious by nature, years of farm work had burned that out of him, but because something about the silence behind him demanded care. The wind hummed against the windows, carrying the dry scent of sage and dust. It was the same road he had driven 1,000 times, yet it felt altered now, weighted with a quiet responsibility he hadn't planned on carrying home. When the farm finally came into view, it looked exactly as it always had. A low, weathered house crouched against the endless land, fences leaning at tired angles, fields stretching outward in dull shades of gold and brown. Nothing about it promised safety or comfort. It was simply a place that had learned how to last. Caleb parked near the old barn, cut the engine, and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. The silence pressed in, thick and familiar. He thought briefly of how many evenings he'd sat like this since his wife passed, just him, the quiet, and the feeling that the world kept moving while he stayed right where he was. He stepped out and opened the trailer slowly. The filly didn't rush the opening. She didn't back away either. She stood there, legs trembling, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, trying to understand this new space. The barn smelled of hay and old wood, of seasons stacked one on top of another. Caleb loosened the rope and waited. He had learned patience the hard way, through broken machinery, stubborn livestock, and grief that refused to be hurried. Eventually, she took one tentative step down, then another. Up close, her condition was clearer. She was underfed, her coat dull, her ribs faintly visible beneath the mud. She leaned slightly to one side, as if the ground itself felt unreliable. Caleb guided her into an empty stall, spreading fresh straw with movements that were practiced but gentle. He set down a bucket of water and a small pan of soaked grain, careful not to crowd her. She didn't touch either. Caleb wasn't surprised. He leaned against the stall door, arms resting loosely at his sides, and stayed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards along the barn wall. The filly startled, her head snapping up, muscles tightening. Instinctively, Caleb lowered his gaze and softened his posture, giving her space without leaving. "I know," he said quietly, not even sure why he spoke. "New places take time." The words echoed softly in the stall, sounding more like something meant for himself. As dusk settled, the temperature dropped fast. Caleb fetched an old blanket from the tack room and draped it carefully over the filly's back. She flinched at the touch, but didn't bolt. It felt like a small victory, though he didn't name it as such. He left the barn door open just enough to let light spill in from the house. When he finally turned to go, the filly's eyes followed him, alert and wary. Caleb paused, then pulled an overturned crate near the stall and sat down instead. He stayed there until the stars began to prick the sky. That night, sleep came in fragments. Caleb woke more than once, listening to the wind, the creak of the house settling, the imagined sounds of something going wrong. Near midnight, he pulled on his boots and went back out to the barn. The filly was standing just as he'd left her, eyes reflecting faint light, her breathing quick and shallow. He didn't step inside. He simply sat on the crate again, hands clasped loosely, letting the quiet do what it always did, stretch, settle, and eventually soften. In that stillness, something shifted. Not in a dramatic way. No revelation. Just a subtle awareness that staying mattered. That being present, even without answers, was sometimes enough. By morning, the filly had taken a few mouthfuls of grain. Not much, but enough for Caleb to notice. As dawn broke over the high plains, pale and cool, Caleb stood at the stall door, watching the small chest rise and fall. He realized then that whatever this was, mistake or miracle, he wasn't walking away from it. Not now. Not from her. Morning arrived without ceremony. The sky lightened from steel gray to a thin wash of blue, and the wind eased just enough to let the fields breathe. Caleb stood at the barn door with a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching frost cling to the edges of the fence posts. He hadn't slept much, but the fatigue felt different than it usually did, less hollow, more alert, as if something had quietly shifted overnight. Inside the stall, the filly stood exactly where she had been when he last checked on her. But this time, there was a change so small it might have been imagined. Her head lifted when he entered, not sharply, not in fear, just enough to acknowledge that he was there. Caleb took that as a sign. He moved slowly, setting the coffee down on a ledge, careful not to spill the smell of it into the straw. He replaced the water, refreshed the grain, and waited again. The filly leaned forward, sniffed, then finally lowered her head to eat. The sound was faint. Soft grains nudged against metal, but it carried more weight than any noise had in that barn for years. "Well," Caleb murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "That's something." He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. He stayed near, resting his forearm against the stall rail, letting her decide how close the world was allowed to be. The wind brushed through the open door, lifting the edge of her blanket. She startled, then steadied, as if remembering she hadn't been harmed the last time the air moved like that. It was later that morning, while the sun climbed higher and burned off the frost, that Caleb realized he couldn't keep calling her the filly. Names mattered. They gave shape to things. He'd learned that once, a long time ago, when the house had still echoed with another voice. He watched her as she chewed, the way the light caught the pale strands of her mane, the way her breathing slowed when the barn settled into its daytime rhythm. Outside, the horizon glowed faintly, the sun hovering just above the land in a soft, tentative promise. "Luma," he said quietly, testing the sound of it in the open space. The filly paused. Her ears flicked forward. Caleb nodded once, as if confirming something only he could feel. "Luma," he repeated, "means light, the kind you see before the day really starts." She didn't move closer. She didn't move away. But she stayed, and somehow that felt like agreement. Over the next few days, a rhythm formed, not a routine exactly, but something looser, more forgiving. Caleb worked the fields in the mornings, keeping the barn door open so Luma could see him come and go. He spoke to her without expectation, narrating small things, the weather, the fence line, the way the price of hay had climbed again. He didn't ask for trust. He let it grow where it could. Luma remained cautious. Loud sounds still made her flinch. Sudden movements sent her skittering back to the corner of the stall. But there were changes, subtle as the turning of seasons. She drank without hesitation now. She slept lying down, legs folded beneath her, something Caleb knew animals didn't do unless they felt safe enough to risk it. One afternoon, while cleaning the far stall, Caleb heard a soft shuffle behind him. He turned slowly. Luma stood at the open door of her stall, her head low, eyes focused on him. She took a step forward, then stopped. Caleb didn't move. The air between them felt fragile, like a thread that could snap if pulled too hard. After a long moment, she took another step, close enough that he could see the fine dust clinging to her coat, the faint scar along her shoulder he hadn't noticed before. "That's far enough," he said gently. "You don't owe me anything." She stood there anyway. It was then he noticed how she stood when she wasn't afraid. Balanced, centered, her weight distributed in a way that looked intentional. He'd spent his life around animals. He knew the difference between weakness and restraint. Luma wasn't clumsy. She was careful. That realization followed him into the evening. As the light faded, Caleb sat on the same crate he'd claimed as his place and watched Luma settle for the night. The barn felt less empty than it used to. The quiet had changed. It no longer pressed in from all sides. It held. Later, as the stars emerged one by one, Caleb leaned his head back against the wooden post and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, his thoughts didn't circle loss or money or the slow erosion of time. They rested on something smaller, something present. He opened his eyes when he felt it. A gentle brush against his sleeve. Luma stood. Beside him, close enough that her warmth reached his arm. She didn't linger. After a second, she stepped back, returning to her stall. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good night, Luma," he said softly. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Outside, the wind picked up again, moving through the fields with its familiar, restless sigh. Inside the barn, two lives settled into the dark, not healed, not whole, but no longer alone. The first comment reached Caleb before the week had finished turning over. It came from the gravel road that cut past his south fence, carried on the wind with a careless ease. A truck slowed, then stopped. Two men leaned out the windows, eyes tracking the small figure moving in the paddock. One of them laughed, not loud, not cruel enough to be confronted, just loud enough to be heard. "Didn't know you'd opened a petting zoo, Turner." Caleb kept working. He tightened the last staple into the post, feeling the vibration hum up his arm. He didn't look over. He'd learned years ago that some remarks only grew stronger when fed. The truck rolled on, laughter fading into dust. Luma paused at the sound, ears flicking, her body tensing for a moment before she steadied herself and went back to grazing. By afternoon, the looks had multiplied. A neighbor slowed his tractor longer than necessary. Someone at the feed store asked, with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, if Caleb was planning to breed rabbits next. The nickname surfaced by evening, the dollar horse, and it stuck faster than he expected. Caleb said nothing. He paid for his supplies, nodded once to Martha behind the counter, and drove home. The words followed him anyway, clinging to the silence in the cab. He hadn't realized how much peace he'd carved out for himself over the years until it was tested by other people's opinions. It wasn't anger that unsettled him. It was doubt, thin, persistent, and sharp around the edges. At the farm, he let Luma into the small paddock behind the barn. She moved carefully at first, testing the ground as if it might betray her, then began to explore. She didn't run. She traced the fence line instead, nose low, cataloging smells and textures with a seriousness that made Caleb smile despite himself. A voice drifted over the fence from the neighboring property. "You sure that thing's worth feeding?" Caleb turned. The Dawson brothers stood side by side, arms folded, hats tilted back just enough to signal curiosity dressed as concern. They weren't bad men, they were practical men, and practical men didn't believe in wasted effort. "She looks like she'd blow away in a stiff wind," one of them added. "Winter's coming." Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans. "She's managing." The brothers exchanged a look. "Managing ain't thriving," the older one said. "You don't owe her anything, Caleb." Caleb felt the words land heavier than they were. Meant to. He glanced at Luma, who had stopped near the fence, her body angled toward him as if she sensed the shift. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply said, "I'll take my chances." The brothers shrugged and moved on, conversation already turning to something else. For them, it was finished. For Caleb, it lingered. That night, the wind returned with force, slamming into the side of the barn and rattling the loose boards. Luma startled hard, bolting a few steps before stopping short, breathing fast. Caleb was there almost immediately, not touching, just standing where she could see him. He stayed until her breathing slowed, until the fear passed through her like a wave and receded. Later, sitting alone in the house, Caleb stared at the ledger spread across the table. Numbers stared back. Feed costs, fuel, repairs he'd postponed too long. The math didn't work. Not cleanly, not safely. He could see why people laughed. He could see why they thought he'd made a mistake. He folded the ledger shut. In the days that followed, the laughter sharpened. Someone left a note in his mailbox with a crude drawing and a single dollar taped to it. Caleb tore it in half without reading it twice. Luma sensed the tension. She grew clingier, shadowing him along the fence, pausing whenever he paused, as if afraid he might disappear. One afternoon, as Caleb leaned against the rail watching her move, he noticed something he hadn't before. When a gust of wind rattled the far gate, she flinched, but she didn't lose her balance. She shifted her weight smoothly, instinctively, correcting herself with a precision that felt out of place for an animal everyone else saw as weak. He frowned, studying her more closely. The way she stood, the way she turned. There was an economy to her movements, a quiet efficiency. She wasn't fragile. She was cautious. And there was a difference. That evening, as the sun sank low and turned the fields copper, Caleb rested his arms on the fence and spoke softly, not to the world beyond it, but to the small horse standing on his side. "They don't see it," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact. "Maybe I don't either. Not yet." Luma lifted her head and stepped closer, pressing her muzzle briefly against the wood. The contact was light, almost accidental, but it steadied something in him. The laughter didn't stop, but it no longer felt like the loudest thing on the land. Something quieter had taken hold, something that didn't need defending. Only time. The change revealed itself without announcement, the way most important things did on the high plains. It was late afternoon, the sun leaning westward, when Caleb finished repairing the far gate and turned back toward the paddock. Luma stood alone near the center, head lifted, ears alert, watching a hawk circle high above the fields. The wind shifted suddenly, strong enough to rattle the loose tin along the barn roof. Caleb expected her to startle. Instead, she moved, not quickly, not nervously. She stepped forward, then broke into a light run, more instinct than effort, her legs stretching into a smooth, measured rhythm that carried her across the grass. There was no wasted motion, no panic. She adjusted to the uneven ground as if she'd memorized it, shoulders lifting, hindquarters engaging with a balance that stopped Caleb cold. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowing, his mind snapping into a focus he hadn't felt in years. She wasn't fast in the way big horses were fast. She was clean. Each stride landed exactly where it needed to, as though the ground itself were guiding her. When she slowed, she did so without stumbling, head high, breathing steady. She turned back toward him, ears forward, as if asking whether he'd seen it too. Caleb exhaled. "All right," he said under his breath. "I see you." The moment followed him into the next day, then the next. He watched more carefully now. When Luma moved, he paid attention not to her size, but to her control. When she spooked, she recovered faster than expected. When she changed direction, she pivoted with an ease that felt practiced, even though he knew she'd never been trained. It was enough to make him call Dr. Helen Moore. Helen arrived 2 days later in a dust-coated sedan that had seen better decades. She stepped out with the same unhurried confidence she brought to everything. Gray hair tucked under a sun-faded cap, hands already reaching for her gloves. "So," she said, eyes flicking toward the paddock, "this is the famous dollar horse." Caleb didn't rise to the bait. He opened the gate instead. Helen watched in silence as Luma moved. She asked Caleb to walk her, then trot her. She circled slowly, eyes sharp, fingers tapping her chin. When Luma shifted her weight, Helen's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. "Well, I'll be," she murmured. "What?" Caleb asked. "She's built differently," Helen said. "Compact, balanced. Those joints are stronger than they look. And see how she places her hooves? That's not fear. That's awareness." Caleb swallowed. "Is that good?" Helen straightened, brushing dust from her knees. "It's rare, not useful to everyone, but rare." The words settled heavily between them. "I'm not saying she's a racer," Helen continued, reading his expression, "but I am saying she moves like she understands her body. Most horses never do." That night, Caleb sat alone with the thought. Rare, useful. The ledger lay unopened on the table, the numbers waiting patiently. He thought about feed costs, about livestock insurance policies he barely kept active, about how one unexpected vet bill could undo him. He thought about the way Luma had run, light and sure, as if the land had made room for her. A week later, he agreed to try. The local stock horse run wasn't much. No grandstands, no sponsors, no glossy banners advertising premium horse, trailers or farm equipment financing. Just a dirt track carved into a field and a handful of competitors looking for weekend pride. Caleb told himself it was just a test, nothing more. On race day, Luma trembled as the noise rose around her. Caleb felt the familiar tug of doubt tighten in his chest. He knelt beside her, resting his forehead briefly against her neck, breathing until her shaking slowed. "Just move the way you know how," he whispered. "That's all." When the signal came, Luma hesitated half a second too long. A ripple of laughter moved through the small crowd. Then she found her rhythm. She didn't surge ahead. She slipped forward, hugging the inside line, her strides lengthening with every breath. One by one, she passed the others, not by force, but by precision. When she crossed the line first, the laughter vanished, replaced by startled silence. Caleb stood frozen, heart pounding, as a cheer rose somewhere behind him. Later, holding the small payout check in his hand, Caleb felt a strange mix of pride and fear. The money barely covered feed for a month. But the looks he received, curious now, cautious, told him something had shifted. As they drove home, Luma quiet in the trailer, Caleb realized this was no longer just about staying. It was about choosing a direction. And for the first time, that choice scared him more than the laughter ever had. Back on his land, The victory didn't sound like applause. It sounded like the wind tugging at fence wire, like a loose hinge tapping the barn frame, like a horse breathing steady in the dark. Caleb pulled into the drive at dusk and shut off the engine, letting the silence swallow the day. The small check from the race sat on the passenger seat, thin paper that felt heavier than it should have, because it wasn't really about the money. It was about what the paper implied. A direction. A door cracked open. He fed Luma first, he always did. He moved with the same careful calm he'd practiced since bringing her home. But now he noticed how she watched him, more present, less skittish, like she'd started recognizing the pattern of his kindness and trusting it would repeat. When she finished, she nudged the edge of the bucket with a soft clink, then lifted her head and looked at him, ears forward, eyes bright in the barn's amber light. Caleb swallowed, suddenly uneasy with how much that look could pull at him. "Don't get ideas," he muttered, but his voice wasn't sharp. It was almost tender. The next morning, the farm felt different. Not brighter, not easier, just watched. A pickup slowed on the gravel road and didn't roll past right away. Two women in town stopped talking when he entered the hardware store and then resumed with softer voices when he walked by. At the feed store, Martha slid his receipt across the counter and raised one eyebrow the way she did when she already knew something. "I heard you caused a little scene," she said. Caleb stared at the stacked bags of alfalfa behind her as if they might answer for him. "It was a small run." Martha's mouth twitched. "Small run? Big talk? Folks are saying your little filly ran like she had a compass in her hooves." Caleb didn't respond. He paid for a roll of fence wire and a salt block and left with the uncomfortable sense that the world had leaned in closer. 2 days later, a young woman showed up at his gate with a notebook and dust on her boots like she'd driven too fast down back roads. She introduced herself as Sienna Hart, a freelance writer who sometimes contributed to the county paper and, when stories were slow, posted local features online where they reached farther than anyone expected. "I'm not here to bother you," she said quickly, as if she'd learned that men like Caleb preferred escape routes. "People are just curious. They like underdog stories, especially out here." Caleb's first instinct was to say no, to shut the gate and retreat into the clean, predictable work of a day that asked nothing from him but labor. But Luma stood behind him in the paddock, not hiding, not trembling, just watching the stranger with a cautious steadiness that made Caleb pause. "What do you want to know?" he asked, already regretting it. Sienna glanced past him toward Luma, her expression softening. "Why her?" she said. "Why take on something everyone else laughed at?" Caleb felt the question hit a place he rarely touched, a place that still held the outline of the life he'd lost. He kept his voice even. "She needed a place," he said. "That's all." Sienna nodded as if that was exactly the answer she'd hoped for. She didn't push. She didn't dramatize. She simply asked to take a photo, Caleb with his hand on Luma's neck, the filly small and pale against his worn jacket. He agreed, because refusing felt like making a bigger deal of it than necessary. By the weekend, the story was everywhere, in the small ways things became everywhere in rural counties. The bulletin board at the diner, the paper stacked by the cash register, a shared link on someone's phone while they filled up at the gas station. The headline wasn't fancy, but it did its job. $1 filly stuns local run. Caleb tried not to read it. He still did. The attention brought other things with it, calls he didn't recognize, numbers from out of state, a voicemail from someone offering to help monetize the moment. Caleb deleted those without listening to the end. He didn't want sponsorships. He didn't want a brand. He didn't even want people saying his name like it belonged to something bigger than his fields. But money was money, and his farm needed it. A week after the win, the furnace made a sound like metal tearing and died in the middle of the night. Caleb stood in the cold kitchen the next morning, staring at the busted unit, calculating. The repair estimate was more than he kept in checking. He found himself thinking about the race check, about the possibility of another one, about the way a small run could, in theory, turn into something that covered a roof patch or a tractor part or a month of feed without having to take out another loan. He hated that thought. It felt like greed, like turning Luma into a solution instead of a living creature. So he did what he always did when he didn't know how to feel. He worked. Caleb began training in a way that respected what Luma was. Short sessions at dawn when the wind was calmer, gentle runs along the edge of the hayfield, careful turns between fence posts set up like markers. He didn't push for speed. He watched for balance. He paid attention to how quickly she recovered when startled, how she placed her hooves on loose gravel, how she handled the slight slope near the creek bed. When she faltered, he stopped. When she tried again on her own, he let her. One morning, Helen arrived again, leaning on the fence with her hands stuffed in her coat pockets. She watched Luma move for several minutes before speaking. "She's learning fast," Helen said. Caleb kept his eyes on the filly. "So am I." Helen's gaze slid to him, sharp and kind at once. "That's the part that matters," she said. "Folks think races are about animals, but the good ones, they're about people learning what they're capable of." Caleb felt something tighten behind his ribs. He didn't answer. The next local event came and went, and Luma placed again, second this time, then first again the following week. Not with brute dominance, but with that same unnerving precision, like she could read the track before it happened. Each time, the crowd grew. Each time, the cameras came out faster. Each time, Caleb's discomfort deepened. After a third win, a man in a clean jacket approached him by the trailers, talking too smoothly, smiling like he'd practiced it. He asked about Luma's future, about bigger circuits, about how the right exposure could mean real money. He tossed phrases around the way gamblers tossed dice: sponsorship, branding, insurance coverage, liability, tax strategy, as if Caleb's life were just another business plan. Caleb's stomach turned. "I'm not interested," Caleb said. The man's smile didn't change. "You should be," he replied. "Opportunities don't wait." Caleb turned away before the conversation could stain him further. That night he sat at his kitchen table with an entry form he'd picked up at the last race. Thicker paper, official logo, a longer drive. The Wyoming Prairie Challenge. Bigger track. Bigger crowd. Bigger pressure. He stared at the blanks, asking for information he barely had. Registration details, vaccination records, emergency contacts, proof of liability insurance. He made a note to call Helen's veterinary clinic in the morning. He made another note to check his farm insurance policy and see what it covered, because the truth was, if Luma got hurt, he couldn't afford not to be prepared. Outside, the wind rose, scraping along the windows like a reminder that winter didn't care about dreams. Caleb looked toward the barn where a small shape shifted in the darkness, and he realized the choice in front of him wasn't only about racing. It was about whether he could step into a louder world without losing the quiet thing he had built with her. He picked up his pen, and his hand hovered over the first blank line. The pen finally touched the paper, and Caleb's name darkened the first line with a slow, careful stroke. The sound of it, ink scratching across a form, felt louder than it should have in the quiet kitchen. He filled in what he could, paused on what he couldn't, and by the time the coffee had gone cold, the envelope was sealed and sitting by the door like a promise he wasn't sure he deserved to make. 2 days later, he stood in Helen Moore's clinic office, hat in hand, listening as she explained vaccination schedules and health certificates with the same blunt calm she used for everything. Caleb asked about liability coverage the way a man asks about weather before a storm, trying to sound casual while knowing it mattered. Helen slid a sheet of recommendations across the counter, then looked him in the eye. "You can't control everything," she said, "but you can prepare for what you can." On the drive home, he stopped at the insurance agent's place in town, the kind of office that smelled like printer paper and old carpet. A poster on the wall promised peace of mind in bold letters. Caleb signed for an updated farm policy that made his stomach knot, then drove back out to the open land, the receipt tucked into his pocket like a thin shield against bad luck. Race day came fast. The Wyoming Prairie Challenge wasn't the county run with folding chairs and neighbors eating chili from paper cups. This place had a real parking lot, real bleachers, vendors selling kettle corn and branded caps, banners advertising truck financing and farm equipment leasing, bright, glossy promises fluttering in the wind. Loudspeakers crackled overhead, announcing heats and numbers with a confident voice that didn't care who was ready. Caleb felt the old instinct to turn around as soon as he pulled in. He didn't. He parked, checked the hitch twice, then opened the trailer. Luma stood inside, ears flicking sharply at the soundscape. Music, voices, engines, the metallic clank of gates. Her eyes were wide, but not panicked yet. Just alert in the way she got when she was trying to understand too much at once. Caleb rested a hand against her neck through the opening. Steady pressure, steady breath. "We're just here to run," he murmured. "Nothing else." She stepped down carefully, hooves touching the gravel like it might bite. Caleb guided her through the parking area where people slowed to look, some with interest, some with smirks. A man in a crisp jacket nodded toward Luma and said something to his friend that made them laugh. Caleb didn't catch the words, but he saw Luma's flinch. He tightened his grip on the lead rope without pulling, letting her feel him there. At the warm-up ring, the ground was different from home, packed dirt over loose sand, ruts carved by heavier horses. Luma started well enough, walking small circles, breathing fast but controlled. Caleb watched her shoulders, her hips, the way she adjusted. He tried to keep his face neutral the way ranchers did when they didn't want anyone to know what they were carrying inside. A woman nearby leaned over the rail and asked, not unkindly, "Is she really as fast as they say?" Caleb hesitated. "She's honest," he said finally. The woman blinked as if that wasn't the answer she expected, then smiled in a softer way. That might be better. They were called to the gate not long after. Caleb led Luma forward, past the bigger horses, past riders in polished boots, past cameras raised in hands that wanted a story. Luma's body tightened, but she kept moving. The starter checked numbers, pointed them to their positions, and the air seemed to hold its breath. Caleb stepped back from the rail. His heart thumped hard enough to be felt in his throat. The signal sounded. The world surged forward. Hooves hit dirt like thunder, a rolling impact that shook the fence line. Luma jolted at the explosion of movement and noise. For a half-second she stalled, not refusing, just startled. Then she launched after the pack. Caleb's chest tightened as the larger horses immediately swallowed the track ahead of her, their bodies throwing dust into the air like smoke. "Easy," Caleb whispered, though no one could hear him. "Find it." Luma tried. At the first curve, the track banked in a way she hadn't practiced. The outer edge was chewed up and loose, the kind of footing that punished hesitation. Luma angled in, aiming for the inside line the way she always did, but another horse cut too close and forced her wider. For an instant, her front hoof slipped. Not a fall, not a disaster, just a fraction of lost grip. But a fraction was enough. Her rhythm broke. You could see it happen, the clean precision that made her special turned jagged for 2 strides. Her head lifted, ears pinned back, and the fear flashed through her body like a current. The pack surged past, dirt spraying. Luma fought to recover, pushing hard, but the gap widened faster than she could close it. Caleb's hands curled around the fence rail until his knuckles went pale. "Come on," he thought. "Come on, girl." Oh. Luma found her balance again by the straightaway, and for a moment, one bright, painful moment, she ran the way she ran at home. Light, controlled, determined. She passed one horse, then another. The crowd made a sound like surprise, but the leaders were already gone, too far ahead. The finish line came too soon. Luma crossed near the back of the field. There was no laughter this time, just a thin murmur of disappointment and the rustle of people shifting their attention to the next heat. Caleb watched Luma slow and turn, and what hurt wasn't the loss. It was the look in her eyes when she found him. Not fear now, something quieter, something like confusion, like she couldn't understand why the world had changed its rules halfway through. When Caleb met her at the rail, he didn't reach for her face or pull her close. He did the only thing he knew that didn't lie. He stayed. He walked beside her as she returned to the trailer, his hand resting lightly along her neck, feeling the heat of her effort through her coat. Luma's breathing was heavy but steady. Her ears flicked back and forth, listening for danger that wasn't there anymore. At the trailers, a man Caleb recognized from earlier, the one with the smooth voice and polished jacket, appeared again as if he'd been waiting. "Tough break," he said, sympathy arranged neatly on his face. "Happens when you jump into bigger leagues. But listen, one bad run doesn't erase her value. If anything, it's the perfect time to talk. Less hype, more realistic pricing." Caleb stared at him, the words landing like gravel in his mouth. He thought about the furnace repair waiting at home, the roof seam that leaked when the wind drove rain sideways, the credit card balance he kept pretending wasn't growing. He thought about financial planning and smart decisions, phrases that sounded responsible when spoken in warm offices with posters on the walls. Then he looked at Luma. She stood with her head lowered, sweat darkening the pale hair along her chest, muscles trembling with leftover adrenaline. She wasn't a commodity calculating risk. She was an animal who had tried her heart out and come up short. Caleb's voice came out low and flat. "Not today." The man lifted his hands as if backing away from a skittish horse. "Just think about it," he said, and disappeared into the noise. The drive home felt longer than it had any right to. The truck headlights carved thin tunnels through the dark, and Caleb's thoughts circled the curve where Luma slipped the moment her rhythm broke. He replayed it until the scene lost all detail and became only a feeling, failure, sharp and stubborn. At the farm, he unloaded her in silence. Luma stepped into the barn and stopped, as if bracing for something. Caleb set water down, then feed. She sniffed the pan, took a few mouthfuls, then paused. Caleb leaned against the stall door, his throat tight. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, surprised by the words. He didn't know if he meant sorry for bringing her there, or sorry for wanting more, or sorry that hope always seemed to come with teeth. Luma lifted her head and looked at him for a long time. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and pressed her muzzle against his forearm. Gentle, deliberate contact. Not an apology, not comfort exactly, more like a reminder that she was still here. Caleb closed his eyes, letting the weight of that small gesture settle into him. Outside, the wind moved across the high plains the way it always did, steady, constant, carrying tomorrow toward them, whether they were ready or not. The next morning came in thin light and hard air. Caleb stepped onto the porch with a coffee mug and a heaviness that hadn't been there before, something that wasn't just disappointment, but the fear that disappointment could become a pattern. The wind moved across the fields like it had business to finish, bending dry grass and rattling the porch railing. Out in the paddock, Luma stood near the fence line, watching him as if she'd been waiting for him to decide what kind of day this would be. Caleb walked to the barn without rushing. Inside, the warmth of hay and wood steadied him, but only a little. He checked Luma's legs, ran his hands lightly along the tendons the way Helen had taught him, looking for heat, swelling, anything that might explain what happened at the challenge. Luma shifted once, then stood still, trusting his touch. She was sound. She was healthy, which meant the problem hadn't been her body. It had been the world. He spent the next week changing everything, not by chasing speed, but by teaching adaptability. He hauled a load of sand from a neighbor's pit and spread it in a long strip behind the barn, then walked Luma through it until she stopped fighting the drag and learned to lift her shoulders. He led her over uneven ground where prairie dog holes made the earth unpredictable, letting her learn to read the surface without panic. He used old boards and a portable speaker and the tailgate of his truck to create noise on purpose, claps, rattles, a burst of recorded crowd sound, then waited for her to startle and recover again and again until the recovery came quicker than the fear. None of it was glamorous. None of it looked like a victory. It looked like sweat and patience and a man learning a new language he didn't know he needed. At night, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his bills spread out like cards in a game he never wanted to play. The furnace repair invoice sat on top, larger than he could pay without dipping into credit again. Beneath it, a notice from the bank about his farm loan rate adjusting next season. A reminder about property insurance renewal. A letter offering refinancing options with words like low monthly payment and limited time opportunity printed in cheerful blue ink. He almost laughed. He found himself searching online for terms he hated: financial planning, tax strategy, small business liability insurance. He didn't want to think like that. He didn't want Luma to become a revenue stream or an asset. But the truth was simple and stubborn. The farm didn't care about his feelings. The farm only cared whether he could keep it running. The second week after the loss, the black SUV returned. Caleb heard it before he saw it, tires crunching slowly on gravel, an engine too quiet and too polished for a place like this. He stepped out from the barn and watched it roll to a stop near the gate. The man who climbed out looked like he belonged under bright lights and air conditioning. He wore clean jeans, a fitted jacket, boots that had never known mud. He smiled the way people smiled when they expected an outcome. "Mr. Turner," he said, offering a hand. "Grant Kessler. We spoke briefly at Prairie Challenge." Caleb didn't take the hand. He kept his posture neutral, farmer still. "You said enough back there." Grant's smile didn't fade. "Fair. That's why I came in person. I prefer respectful conversations. No pressure." The lie sat between them, polite and obvious. Grant glanced past Caleb to where Luma stood in the paddock, ears pricked, watching the stranger with steady caution. "She's even smaller up close," he said softly, almost admiring. "And she still carries herself like she knows something." Caleb waited. Grant reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "I'm going to be direct," he said. "I represent a small group that invests in unusual equine talent. Not just racing, media, exhibitions, licensing, long-term branding. There's real money in a story like hers." Caleb's stomach tightened at the word story. Grant extended the envelope. $300,000, he said. "Cash offer, clean. We handle transport, veterinary review, legal paperwork. You walk away without headaches." Caleb didn't touch it. The wind lifted the edge of Grant's jacket as if the land itself didn't like him standing there. Grant kept talking, measured and practiced. I know what people are saying after the last race, that she has limits, that she can't handle bigger circuits. That's exactly why this is a smart moment. You sell now while the underdog narrative is still hot. You pay off whatever you've got hanging over your head: mortgage, farm loan, repairs, taxes. You can breathe again. Caleb felt heat rise behind his eyes, not from anger, but from how accurately the man had aimed. Caleb thought of the furnace, the roof seam, the fence posts he kept resetting because he couldn't afford new ones. He thought of how tired he was of choosing between feed and fixing things that kept breaking. He thought of what $300,000 could do, how it could pull his farm out of survival mode and into something that looked like safety. He also thought of Luma's muzzle against his forearm the night they got home, and the way she'd kept trying even when the track stole her rhythm. Caleb swallowed. "You're offering me money for her," he said, voice low, "or for the idea of her." Grant's smile softened into something like sympathy. "They're not separate in this. Business. Not if you want her to reach her potential." Caleb stared at the envelope. For a moment his body wanted to take it, not because he was greedy, because he was exhausted. Then Luma took a step closer in the paddock, moving toward the fence as if she felt the tension tighten. She didn't run. She didn't shy away. She just approached, head level, eyes on Caleb, as though checking whether he was still the same man who stayed. Caleb's chest tightened. Grant followed Caleb's gaze and leaned slightly, lowering his voice the way salesmen did when they thought they were offering kindness. "You're a good man, Turner, I can tell. That's why you shouldn't carry this alone. Let professionals handle her. You can visit, you can stay in touch, but you don't have to bleed for a horse." Caleb let out a breath. "She's not making me bleed," he said quietly. "She's the reason I'm still standing." Grant blinked, just once, a crack in the polished mask. Caleb stepped forward, not aggressively, just enough to end the distance. "Take your envelope," he said. "I'm not selling." Grant held still, then let his smile return, thinner now. "Everyone sells," he said. "It's just a matter of price." Caleb looked at him in a way that made the wind feel colder. "Not this," he replied. Grant's eyes flicked toward Luma again, calculating. "You turned down $300,000, he said slowly, as if explaining to a child. "Do you understand what that is in terms of opportunity cost? In terms of financial security?" Caleb's voice didn't rise. "I understand," he said, "and I'm still saying no." For a moment Grant looked like he might argue harder. Then he nodded once, a man filing information away for later. "All right," he said. "No today, but you'll hear from me again. People don't forget a story like hers." He climbed back into the SUV, backed out slowly, and disappeared down the gravel road, leaving only dust and the aftertaste of temptation. Caleb stood there for a long time, staring at the place the vehicle had been. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what he had refused. He imagined the furnace fixed, the roof sealed, the loan paid down, the constant pressure eased. He imagined sleeping without math running through his head. Then he turned toward the paddock. Luma had walked to the fence, close enough that he could reach her without stepping through the gate. Caleb rested his palm against her neck, feeling the warmth of her skin under her pale coat. Luma leaned into the touch like it was something she understood. "I don't know how we're going to do this," Caleb admitted, words barely louder than the wind. "But we're not quitting." Luma breathed out, slow and steady, and in that breath, Caleb heard something he hadn't heard in weeks: calm. He left the bills on the table that night and went back to the barn. Instead, he sat on the crate, listening to Luma shift in the straw, listening to the land settle into darkness. The future still felt big, still loud, still uncertain. But for the first time since Prairie Challenge, Caleb didn't feel like he was walking into it alone. In the quiet, with his hand resting against the stall rail, he said the only promise he could make without lying. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we start again." The following weeks turned Caleb's farm into something it had never been, a quiet training ground shaped by trial, patience, and the kind of stubborn hope that didn't ask permission. Dawn after dawn, he worked Luma through sand that pulled at her legs, over rough patches that forced her to think, past sudden sounds that once made her freeze. He didn't chase speed. He chased steadiness. He chased the moment between fear and recovery, because that was where races were won and where trust was built. Helen came by twice, once with a fresh set of papers and once with a look that said she was trying not to smile. "You're building her a mind," she told him, watching Luma pick her way through uneven ground with calmer eyes. "Most people only build muscle." Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans. "I'm building her a way home." By late fall, the points tallied quietly in the background. Small wins, solid placements, clean runs that brought less cash than they brought credibility. The crowd size didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Luma kept learning, and Caleb kept learning with her. Even the bills on his kitchen table began to feel less like a verdict and more like a challenge. He spoke with his insurance agent again, updated liability coverage, asked Helen about travel stress, and listened when Martha mentioned financial planning like it was something a man could do without losing his soul. Caleb didn't become a different person. He just became a prepared one. Then the envelope arrived. It was thicker than the others, official enough to make his hands pause mid-motion. A stamped logo. A crisp letterhead. The kind of paper you didn't see unless you'd entered a world that ran on sponsors, broadcast schedules, and million-dollar promises. Prairie Crown National Championship. Grand purse, $1,000. Caleb read it twice, then a third time, like the words might rearrange themselves into something smaller and safer. Helen, when he called, didn't laugh. "They don't invite miracles," she said. "They invite competitors." She earned it. Caleb hung up and stood in the barn with the letter in his hand while Luma chewed hay, calm as if nothing in the universe had changed. The irony made his throat tighten. $1 million could pay off his loan, repair the house, fix everything he'd been patching with duct tape and grit. It could turn his exhausted farm into something stable. It could look like security, real security, not the kind printed on posters in insurance offices. But when he looked at Luma, the idea of money didn't light him up. What lit him up was the quiet fact that she had become brave. Travel day came under a steel-colored sky. Caleb loaded the trailer with water, hay nets, blankets, first aid supplies, practical things, grounding things, then climbed into the truck and drove east toward the arena that rose from the plains like a bright white promise. The closer he got, the more the noise seeped into the air, distant loudspeakers, engines, crowds. He passed billboards selling trucks, trailers, and limited-time financing. And he thought absurdly how the world always tried to sell certainty to people who had none. The Prairie Crown venue was nothing like local runs. It was a machine. Shining gates, massive screens, vendor rows advertising equine supplements, premium feed, and asset protection services in glossy booths. Caleb parked where he was told, followed arrows and staff instructions, and felt the strange sensation of being processed. When he opened the trailer, Luma stepped down and froze. Not from fear exactly, more from the sheer volume of everything. The air was thick with unfamiliar scent, hot metal, popcorn, sweat, polished leather, dust kicked up by hundreds of hooves. Voices rolled in waves. Cameras clicked. Somewhere nearby a group laughed too loud, the sound sharp as broken glass. Caleb didn't pull her forward. He simply rested his palm against her neck and breathed until she felt his rhythm. "Easy," he murmured. "We've been louder than this in our heads." Luma's ears flicked. She didn't relax all at once, but she took a step, then another, and the steps were steady. In the warm-up ring, competitors moved like professionals. Big horses, sleek coats, muscles rippling under expensive tack. Handlers in coordinated jackets. Owners with clipped voices discussing odds, sponsorships, and return on investment, the way farmers talked about rainfall. Caleb felt out of place in his worn jacket and dusty boots, a man who still measured value in mornings and effort, not in branding. He caught sight of Grant Kessler near the rail, polished jacket, calm smile, the same envelope-hand confidence. Grant's gaze met Caleb's, and the smile widened slightly, like a man watching a clock. Caleb looked away. A handler near them pointed at Luma and said something under his breath. A few people glanced over, amused. Caleb heard the old tone he'd learned to ignore, the one that said small meant pointless. Luma heard it too. Her muscles tightened, just for a second. Caleb stepped closer and lowered his voice until it belonged only to them. "Just run the way you breathe," he told her. "The rest is noise." When the call came to line up, the arena seemed to sharpen. The track stretched out like a long wound through the dirt, packed and banked, unforgiving. Caleb walked Luma toward the gate with a calm he didn't entirely feel. His heart hammered, but his hands stayed steady on the lead rope. He didn't let the crowd borrow his control. The gates clanked shut. The announcer's voice boomed overhead, naming horses and hometowns like a spectacle. Caleb barely registered his own name when it came, swallowed by cheers and laughter and the roar of a world that loved a story more than it loved a soul. The signal hit. The gate snapped open and the track exploded. Luma launched clean this time. No hesitation, no stutter. Her first strides sharp and measured. Larger horses surged ahead early, powerful bodies eating ground with brute confidence. Dust rose in thick sheets. Caleb's eyes locked on Luma's pale shape near the inside line, watching for the thing he'd trained for, the moment the world tried to steal her rhythm. The first curve came fast. A heavy horse drifted inward, trying to claim the rail. Luma didn't fight it head-on. She adjusted, one quick sidestep, a shift of weight so precise it looked like instinct, and slid into a safer pocket without losing pace. Caleb's breath caught. That was new. That was learning. Down the back stretch, the pack tightened. Hooves hit dirt like a drumline. Luma stayed midfield, patient and light, her ears pinned forward as if the noise behind her didn't matter. Caleb realized with a jolt that she wasn't chasing. She was reading. At the next turn, the leaders began to tire, just slightly, just enough to show. Their strides shortened. Dust thickened. A horse on the outside stumbled, recovered, but the disruption compressed the pack into a chaotic knot. For a heartbeat, it looked like there would be no way through. Then Caleb saw it. A narrow space opened along the inside, not wide enough for most horses to risk, not safe enough for anyone who needed room to think. It was a sliver between the rail and a drifting body, a gap that would close in seconds. Luma saw it too. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She folded into the opening like wind through a crack, shoulders lifting, hooves placing with surgical certainty. The crowd made a sound, one collective inhale, because what she was doing looked impossible. She threaded through the gap, dust spraying against her pale coat, and came out the other side, already accelerating. Caleb's throat tightened so hard it hurt. The final stretch blurred. The leaders were still ahead, but the distance shrank with every stride. Luma's legs moved like something built for precision rather than power, eating ground in clean, efficient bites. One horse tried to drift inward again. Luma pivoted around the pressure with a quickness that made the bigger animal look clumsy. And then, like a quiet thought becoming a certainty, she was beside the front runner. For a moment they ran shoulder to shoulder, the polished favorite, bred and trained for this world, and the small pale filly from a wind-beaten farm that nobody had believed in. The favorite surged. Luma surged back, not with anger, not with desperation, just with steady determination, like finishing what she started was the only truth she knew. She crossed first. The arena erupted. Sound hit like a wave. People screamed and stomped and threw their hands into the air. The announcer's voice broke with excitement as he shouted her name, as if he'd loved her all along. Cameras swung toward Caleb, hungry for the farmer's face, hungry for tears, hungry for proof that miracles were real. Caleb didn't move at first. He couldn't. His legs felt hollow. His heart felt too big for his chest. Then Luma slowed, turned, and came back toward him, breathing hard but controlled, eyes bright and clear. She stopped at the rail, close enough for Caleb to reach her, and pressed her forehead against his chest like she'd done on the hardest nights at home. Caleb's hands shook as he wrapped his arms around her neck. He didn't care who saw. He didn't care what it looked like on camera. He buried his face against her mane and let the tears come, hot and quiet, the way weather came across the plains, inevitable once it started. Somewhere behind him, someone said, "$1 million." Caleb heard it like it was spoken underwater. He lifted his head and looked at Luma, and the words that came out weren't about money at all. "We're okay," he whispered. "We're here." The celebration tried to swallow him whole. Hands reached from every direction. Officials, photographers, strangers with bright eyes and louder voices. Each one wanting a piece of the moment, each one talking about endorsements and interviews, and what this means for your future. A staff member clipped a credential around his neck. Someone guided him toward a small platform where a giant check waited under spotlights like a prop in a show. Caleb stood there with his palms still pressed to Luma's warm neck, feeling her sweat-damp coat beneath his fingers, using that simple contact as an anchor. When the announcer asked him how it felt to become a millionaire, Caleb stared at the microphone as if it were a foreign object. The arena roared again, hungry for the quote that would fit cleanly into a headline and a social media clip. Caleb's throat tightened. He thought of his farm, his broken furnace, the roof seam. He thought of the way he used to sit in his truck at dusk, letting silence close over him because it was easier than feeling too much. He leaned toward the microphone, voice rough and honest. "It feels like she kept her promise," he said, "even when the world didn't." The words weren't polished. They weren't clever. But something in the crowd shifted. An exhale, a different kind of quiet, because they could tell he meant it. Later, in the chaos of paperwork and signatures, a representative from the championship office walked him through forms that made his head ache. Tax withholding options, payout schedules, verification documents. The language was precise, almost cold. Caleb heard phrases like lump sum, deferred payment, financial advisory, and he felt the old reflex to retreat, because numbers and contracts had never been where he felt safe. Helen appeared beside him as if she'd been summoned by his discomfort. She didn't smile. She didn't make a speech. She just stood close and said quietly, "Don't sign anything you don't understand. You can take it home. You can breathe." Caleb nodded, grateful in a way he didn't have words for. At the edge of the crowd, he caught sight of Grant Kessler again. Grant stood with his hands in his pockets, face unreadable, watching Caleb with the same calculating calm as always. For a moment, Caleb thought Grant might approach, might try one last time to turn Luma into a transaction. But Grant only lifted his chin in a small, acknowledging nod, less respect, more recognition that the story had slipped beyond his control. Caleb turned away before the look could stain his joy. That night, when the arena finally dimmed and the last of the trucks rolled out, Caleb sat in the trailer lot beside Luma's stall, listening to her chew hay in slow, steady mouthfuls. The world around them had grown quieter, but not peaceful. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It arrived like dawn, thin at first, then slowly filling the spaces. He rested his forearms on his knees and stared at the distant glow of the arena lights, feeling the weight of everything that had changed in a single day. The money would come. The attention would follow. People would want interviews, appearances, maybe even a documentary offer. Someone had already slipped him a business card with the words "Brand Partnerships" printed in bold. It was all sitting in his pocket like a temptation. Caleb's chest tightened at the thought of losing what mattered most. He stood and stepped into the trailer, moving slowly so he wouldn't startle her. Luma lifted her head, ears forward, eyes calm. Caleb rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the warm scent of hay and horse and honest effort. "We go home," he whispered. "That's the deal." Luma exhaled softly, the breath brushing his cheek like agreement. Home looked smaller when they returned, as if the land hadn't caught up to the scale of what had happened. The same weathered house, the same leaning fences, the same barn with old boards that creaked in the wind. But when Caleb stepped out of the truck, the place felt different. Not because the farm had changed, but because he had. He didn't rush to spend the money. He didn't buy a new truck or build a flashy arena. For the first week, he did nothing but feed Luma, fix the furnace, and sleep longer than he had in years. The quiet nights felt strange at first, like he didn't know what to do without worry running through him. Then they began to feel like something else. Relief. Word of the wind traveled faster than wind. The county paper ran a full-page spread. Online, the clip of Luma threading through that narrow gap replayed thousands of times. People who'd never heard of Caleb Turner suddenly knew his name. Calls came from brands offering premium feed, equine supplements, and exclusive sponsorship deals. A man from a national outlet asked if Caleb would fly to New York for an interview. Caleb said no to most of it, not out of pride, out of protection. He met with a financial advisor in town only after Helen insisted, and Martha offered to sit with him. The advisor wore a clean suit and spoke in careful terms: asset protection, long-term planning, taxes, liability. Words Caleb once would have rejected on instinct. But this time he listened, not because he wanted luxury, but because he wanted stability, because he understood now that money, handled well, could become a tool instead of a trap. One evening, as the first snow threatened in the sky, Caleb walked the perimeter of his land with a flashlight, checking fences the way he always did. He paused at the far end of the pasture, where an old section of barn foundation lay half buried under weeds, something his wife had once talked about turning into a small shelter for injured animals. She'd said it casually years ago, as if dreams were allowed to be simple. Caleb stood there a long time with the snow wind pushing against his face, remembering her voice like it was carried on the air. He didn't feel crushed by the memory the way he used to. He felt guided by it. The idea formed slowly, not as a grand project, but as a natural extension of the thing he and Luma had already been living. Small lives mattered. Overlooked things could recover. A place could be built where fear didn't have to be hidden. By spring, the old foundation was cleared. Caleb hired local hands to restore the barn structure instead of tearing it down, paying fair wages without bargaining. Folks who had laughed months earlier showed up with tools anyway, some out of guilt, some out of curiosity, some because they wanted to be near hope while it was still warm. Martha brought coffee and biscuits the first day and declared loudly that Caleb Turner was a stubborn fool in the best possible way. Even the Dawson brothers arrived with a truck bed full of lumber, standing awkwardly at the gate like men who didn't know how to apologize. "We figured," one of them muttered, rubbing the back of his neck, "you might need a hand." Caleb studied them for a moment, then opened the gate. "Grab a hammer," he said, and that was the closest thing to forgiveness either side needed. The building took shape over weeks, a simple rehab shelter with wide windows, sturdy stalls, and a small room that wasn't fancy, but was warm. Space for people to sit and breathe without being asked to explain themselves. Caleb didn't put his name on the sign. He put hers. Luma's Haven. The first animals arrived quietly. An old mare with a limp, a rescued pony with fear in its eyes, a thin gelding. That flinched at human touch. And then the people started coming too. Not crowds, not media, just individuals. A ranch hand who'd lost his home to debt, a widow who couldn't sleep in her empty house, a young father carrying the weight of a failing farm and trying not to let his kids see it. Caleb didn't call it therapy. He didn't advertise it. He simply offered routine, work, and the presence of an animal that knew how to survive panic without letting it become the whole story. Luma moved among them with a calm intelligence, standing close when someone's hands shook, stepping back when space was needed, nudging gently when a person drifted too far inside their own head. One afternoon, Caleb watched from the barn doorway as a boy, no older than 10, stood frozen beside the fence, too afraid to step into the pasture. Luma approached slowly, stopped at a respectful distance, and lowered her head, waiting. The boy reached out one trembling hand. Luma didn't flinch. The hand found her mane. The boy's shoulders loosened like a knot finally undone. Caleb's throat tightened, not with sadness this time, with something warmer. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the fields and painted the grass in soft gold, Caleb sat on the porch steps with Luma standing beside him. The wind was gentle, almost kind, carrying the smell of fresh soil and distant rain. The farm behind them hummed with quiet life, tools put away, stalls clean, a light glowing in the shelter window like a promise that someone inside was safe. Caleb rested his hand against Luma's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath her skin, and finally allowed himself to say what he'd been carrying since the day he raised his hand in that dusty yard. "I thought I was the one saving you," he murmured. Luma leaned in and, pressing her shoulder lightly against him, as if she'd heard the truth behind the words. Caleb smiled, small and tired and real. "Turns out," he said softly, "you were the best investment I never meant to make." He didn't say it for the cameras. There were none. He didn't say it for the story. He said it because the air was quiet and the land was home, and he could finally feel, without fear, that a life rebuilt from $1 of compassion was still a life worth living. If Caleb and Luma's story moved you, tell me this in the comments. What would you have done with that $1 filly? Keep her or sell her? I read every comment. If you want more real, heartfelt animal stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. The next story might be the one that stays with you the longest.